On April 17, 1955, Albert Einstein was hospitalized due to chest pain. At that moment, he was unaware, but the largest artery in his body, the aorta, had ruptured in the abdominal section, causing internal bleeding, known as an abdominal aortic aneurysm. At the time, he was busy preparing a speech he was going to read on television for the 7th anniversary of Israel's founding. His doctors immediately wanted to operate on him, but since Einstein had already undergone surgery for the same reason 8 years earlier, he must have realized that his time had come. He refused with these immortal words, "I will die when I choose to. There is no point in artificially prolonging life. I have done my share, it is time to go. I will do it elegantly." And indeed, in the early hours of the next day, he passed away at Princeton Plainsboro Hospital. Those who have watched House MD will recognize the name of this hospital. In reality, the hospital shown in the series has no connection to the one where Einstein died, but the writers probably chose the name deliberately. The truly fascinating part, however, happened during Einstein's autopsy. Pathologist Thomas Harvey, just 7 hours after the great genius's death, removed Einstein's brain without his family's consent and preserved it by injecting it with 10% formalin. His aim was to study what made this unique brain so intelligent. But Einstein despised being idolized, and for this reason, he had requested that his body be cremated and his ashes scattered secretly. Harvey, therefore, had violated Einstein's will. Not only did he take his brain, but he also removed Einstein's eyes and gave them as a gift to Einstein's ophthalmologist, Henry Abrams. When Harvey realized he might get into trouble, he approached Einstein's son, Hans, to persuade him of the importance of what he had done and managed to secure retroactive permission. In this way, he escaped legal consequences. But Hans had one condition. His father's brain was to be studied only for scientific research and the findings published in reputable academic journals. Harvey promised to do so and said he would publish his results within a year. And indeed, since then, Einstein's brain has been the subject of multiple scientific studies. One of the most widespread myths about Einstein is the claim that despite being so intelligent, his school grades were as bad as anyone else's. First of all, you need to stop lying to yourself. Of course, school grades alone are not enough to determine one's future, but that doesn't change the fact that Einstein's grades were actually quite good. How do we know this? For example, take a look at his report card from September 30th, 1896, when he was in his final year of high school. Just as it is today, in Switzerland at the end of the 1800s, the highest grade was 6 and the lowest was 1. If you look closely at the report card, you can see that he got 6s in algebra, geometry, physics, and history, 5s in chemistry, natural history, and German language and literature, and 4s in drawing and geography. His lowest grade was a 3 in French language and literature. Not bad at all. And Einstein wasn't only successful in high school. When he first started school, his mother Pauline wrote a letter to her sister saying, "Yesterday Albert received his report card. Once again, he is at the top of his class, and his grades are excellent." In other words, Einstein was a very successful student throughout his school years. Of course, like any student, he also clashed with some of his teachers. For instance, in middle school at the then-named Luitpold Gymnasium, one of his teachers once said, "I wish Einstein were not my student." But the reason was not that Einstein was lazy. It was because he would often sit at the back of the class, smiling at what was being taught. His teacher thought Einstein was showing him disrespect, and at one point even snapped at him, saying, "You will never amount to anything." But we cannot judge someone's entire academic life based on a few anecdotes like this. When we look at Einstein's overall performance and grades, it becomes clear that he was by no means a failing student. So why do people keep spreading this nonsense? There's something comforting about believing that even Einstein was once treated as stupid by the education system. And indeed, Einstein, like many of us, despised the militaristic tone and rigid structure of schooling, something he mentioned repeatedly in his letters. But that's not the whole story. Another potential source of the claim that Einstein had bad grades lies in the grading systems themselves. Einstein was born on March 14, 1879, in the German Empire and studied there until high school. In the German system, the number 1 was the highest grade and 6 the lowest. So his report cards from Germany were filled with 1s, meaning the best marks. But many people, confusing this with the Swiss system, assumed those 1s meant the lowest grades. To complicate matters further, the Swiss high school Einstein attended followed the German grading system until 1896, his final year. Only then did they switch to the reversed system, where 6 was the highest and 1 the lowest. The report card I mentioned earlier was the first to use this new system. Naturally, this has caused plenty of confusion, but based on family letters and the remaining school records, we can see that Einstein's grades were always good or very good. So what explains his strong grades and later, his brilliance? Could the secret lie in his brain? This has fascinated scientists for decades, not only in Einstein's case, but in geniuses in general. Can we pinpoint something in the brain that makes someone a genius? Are they born this way, or do their brains adapt because they obsessively focus on specific problems, causing certain regions to develop more? Can we tell the difference? Thanks to pathologist Thomas Harvey, who, perhaps mesmerized by the sheer scale of the mystery before him, took it upon himself, whether or not it was his place, to remove Einstein's brain. We now have some clues. After extracting it, Harvey photographed the brain dozens of times. Then, together with his mentor Harry Zimmerman, cut it into 240 blocks, each about 10 cubic centimeters. He also prepared microscope slides from these samples. The dissections were made following the Cerebral Cortex Atlas published in 1925 by Economo and Koskinas, which itself largely followed the brain region map defined by Brodmann in the 19th century. In other words, the sections corresponded to regions associated with particular brain functions. The problem was that neither Harvey nor Zimmerman had any real expertise in neuroscience or brain research. They were both pathologists, trained mainly to recognize injuries, hemorrhages, and other pathological conditions. They lacked the knowledge needed to uncover the secrets of this extraordinary brain. This is why Harvey never fulfilled the promise he made to Hans Einstein, to publish his findings within a year. He simply didn't know what he was looking for, and soon this became a major problem. Even though he had Hans's retroactive consent, the hospital's chief decided it wasn't enough to excuse Harvey's ethical breach. Just days after the autopsy, Harvey was forced to resign. Unable to find work in New Jersey for a long time, Harvey moved to the American Midwest, carrying with him 2 large jars containing Einstein's brain, and worked there as a general practitioner. He was eccentric, even dreamy, and for that reason no academic took him seriously. For 30 years after Einstein's death, Harvey failed to convince anyone to study the brain. Eventually, he even tried to hand the brain over to Einstein's grandson, who lived in California, but the grandson refused to accept it. After years of wandering across the country with the jars in tow, Harvey finally returned to Princeton and handed over the specimens to the pathologist who had succeeded him. Thus ended a 40-year odyssey. Only then did researchers begin to show renewed interest. The first scientific study on Einstein's brain was published in 1999, 44 years after his death. Since then, a few more studies have examined the remaining tissue and the original photographs, and the findings are quite fascinating. First of all, Einstein's brain was not larger than average. In fact, it was rather small. A man of his age and body weight would normally have a brain weighing about 1,400 grams, but Einstein's weighed only 1,230 grams. Of course, a larger brain doesn't necessarily mean greater intelligence. A smaller brain, if packed with denser neural connections, could actually process information more efficiently. But in Einstein's case, researchers have identified variations that go beyond just size. Let me show you a few of them directly. Look, this is the brain of an average person. Here is the frontal cortex, the front part of your brain. This is the right hemisphere, and this is the left hemisphere. The gap in the middle is the longitudinal fissure, which separates the two hemispheres and contains the connecting bridge, called the corpus callosum. If you look carefully at the front part of the brain, you'll notice three ridges, or gyri. 1, 2, 3. Now let's look at one of the photos of Einstein's brain taken by Harvey from the same angle. Here is the gap separating the two hemispheres. Let's count the main ridges again. 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks like he has an extra gyrus. This additional fold is in the right frontal lobe, which is associated with nonverbal, math-like abilities. In the same photo, do you see this enormous fold? If you look at a standard human brain, you won't find anything like it. This region is what we can call the hand knob, or because of its resemblance to the Greek letter omega, the omega sign. This area is responsible for the dexterous movements of our hands and fingers. Previous studies have shown that people who start playing the violin between the ages of 6 and 14 often have this kind of knob in their brains. Just by looking at this brain, we can tell that Einstein played the violin with his right hand and that he started before the age of 14. Indeed, Einstein began playing the violin at the age of 6, under the guidance of his pianist mother, and he never gave it up throughout his life. Here we see the front of Einstein's left brain. Again, the fissure separating the hemispheres is here. Even if you knew nothing about the brain, something abnormal would probably catch your eye by now. Look at the size of this gyrus. In a normal brain, the same structure should be about the same size as the others. This area is the motor cortex, which controls voluntary functions like hand movements. Another finding, which I can't show you with a photo, was discovered by counting the neurons in Einstein's brain slices under the microscope. It turned out that the number of neurons in Brodmann area 39, located in the left hemisphere, was lower than in a normal brain. This region is related to word comprehension and language processing, and indeed, Einstein couldn't speak fluently until the age of 6, and for a long time he suffered from dyslexia-like difficulties, such as being unable to put thoughts into writing, failing to recall words, and struggling with reading aloud. Unlike some other geniuses, Einstein didn't start reading at age 2 or pondering abstract mathematics at 4. Einstein did not think by writing or with words. In fact, when people told him that most individuals have an inner voice that thinks in words, he laughed. Einstein thought more in terms of colors and music. In other words, he was a synesthete. When stuck on a problem, instead of sitting down and doing calculations, he would sometimes play the violin for hours. Suddenly, inspiration would strike, and then he would translate his thoughts into mathematics. Einstein's way of perceiving the universe was also quite unusual. While other physicists drew strength from mathematics or experiments, Einstein drew it from aesthetics. The one who described this best was another great physicist, Paul Dirac. He said, Einstein did not try to build a theory that matched the observations. That's what most people do. Einstein approached things very differently. He asked himself, if I were God, would I have created this part of the universe in this way? And depending on the answer he gave himself, he decided whether he liked a theory or not. This very peculiar life philosophy, rooted in aesthetics, guided Einstein throughout his life, both toward truth and toward error. For example, when developing the theory of relativity, especially special relativity, which described space and time as parts of the same fabric, this aesthetic perception strongly influenced him. But the same aesthetic approach also delayed him for nearly 2 years in formulating general relativity, the theory that extended special relativity. Because he often preferred the more beautiful to the more mathematical, he kept wandering into wrong directions. Only when he set aside aesthetics and surrendered himself to mathematics was he finally able to develop general relativity, explaining how mass interacts with the fabric of space-time. When he saw the success this shift in perspective brought him, he spent the rest of his life relying less on aesthetics and more on pure mathematics. But this, frankly, made him less productive in the second half of his life. Moreover, because relativity was built upon classical physics, Einstein could never truly embrace quantum mechanics, which shattered the foundations of classical physics, and this caused him to make many mistakes. Of course, researchers also found other features in Einstein's brain that reflected his genius in mathematics and physics. For instance, his left lobe, responsible especially for mathematics, reading long texts, writing, and symbolic thinking, was about 15% larger than average. Some studies also showed that in the left hemisphere, both the hippocampus, related to memory, and the neocortex, related to higher-level cognitive functions, were enlarged. Finally, the corpus callosum, the bridge connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, was denser than in a typical person. This may explain why his brain worked almost like a supercomputer. There were, without doubt, distinctive differences in Einstein's brain. The critical question is this: was Einstein born with this brain anatomy, and is that what made him so intelligent? Or did the regions of his brain develop over time because he spent years devoted to advanced mathematics and physics? Let's make this clear. The brain is definitely not a static structure. It's like warm plastic. You can bend and shape it as you wish. We call this neuroplasticity. For example, when you first learn the basics of math or physics in elementary school, some of the nearly 100 billion neurons in your brain form entirely new connections to process this new information. The more you focus on these subjects, the more you push yourself to tackle what you don't understand, the stronger and more numerous these connections become. In other words, as you learn, the very structure of your brain changes. Most of these changes, however, happen only at the microscopic level, so it's very unlikely for them to create macro-scale differences, such as the ones affecting the folds of the brain that we saw in the earlier photos. For instance, by the age of 6, the human brain has already reached about 90% of its adult form. Therefore, if life experiences influence the folding of the brain at all, that influence must begin before the age of 6. And we know that at that age, Einstein was not yet pondering physics. His interest in science began at age 5, when his father gave him a compass, but he only started reflecting seriously on such subjects 5 to 10 years later. We still know very little about how later life experiences affect the brain's folds and macroanatomy. So, based on current evidence, it's very likely that Einstein was born with at least a significant portion of these variations in his brain. Most historians of physics agree that what truly made Einstein Einstein were his environment and life experiences. We can say this much: Einstein did not become a genius just by sitting around, relying solely on his innate abilities. The learning difficulties he faced as a child likely forced him to think and learn in different, unconventional ways. Einstein also had the habit of obsessing over specific problems and pursuing them with stubborn persistence. Even while working at the patent office to earn a living, he never stopped thinking about physics problems or keeping up with the work of the most respected academics of his time. Thanks to his diligence, perseverance, and determination, he was able to turn his natural talent into groundbreaking achievements. Perhaps Einstein's genes and brain structure gave him certain advantages. Maybe you weren't born with a brain like Einstein's, or maybe your school grades were worse than his. That's something you can't really change now. But there are things you can change, and most people hardly ever make use of them. For instance, the power of neuroplasticity, or the ability to put yourself in situations that can lead to success. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content like this.